I'll try to stick to the time. So if you would like more details, less details, particularly on the practical aspects, then please let me know, or we have, I think, enough time at the end for questions, answers, discussions, and so on. So, and if there's anything that is unclear, you can also very welcome to interrupt me during the presentation. Perfect. So I talked just very briefly about Safer World, to move on then to broader trends in security. And then we talk more about like the community security approach, and how that works out at the local level. And then, yeah, as I said, challenges, talking about a couple of questions where we would also like to get your thoughts, because we also, like, I think, constantly learning and thinking and reflecting. So it would be really interesting to get your thoughts as well. I don't know if you know Safer World. So Safer World is an independent international organization working to prevent violence and prevent conflict and build safer lives. We work particularly with local people to understand their concerns and to improve their sense of safety and security, but also with government stakeholders, with civil society. So we work at different levels. We do direct work, as I said, with community members, but we also do a lot of research. We do advocacy, so we try to link those different aspects of our work. And by learning from our experiences from the field and trying to pull out best practices, we also try to have an impact at the policy level, so to go beyond the local level, and we will talk about that a little bit more later. And we work in I think more than 20 countries in Africa, Asia, and Europe. Yeah, that's where we work. I guess you all are probably very familiar with different security concepts, and you're also very familiar with what is written here behind me on the screen from the Human Development Report from UNDP. This is basically outlining an understanding of security that goes beyond an approach to security that is very much focused on the military, very much focused on so-called hard security, and broadening the scope of the understanding of security to include also aspects of security that are much more related to day-to-day life, so whether health, employment, relationships between people, community relationships. So security for us, I think, goes obviously beyond the pure military aspects. It's very much about relationships between people, between people within the community, different groups within the community, between the people and security providers, people and government authorities, people and the state. We also see in our work, when we talk to people about what security means to them, that this very wide spectrum always comes out. So depending on who you ask, very often, like within the same community, whether you ask women or men, you will get a different answer. Whether you ask young people or old people, you will get a different answer. And we think that those very individual aspects of security are really important, even though they are like very, very micro. They are important because it is very much about individual perceptions of security. Just to give an example from Nepal, armed violence in Nepal is very, very minimal. I think last year, or 2012, I think there were 40-something cases of armed violence. Yet people feel really insecure, and they think that small arms, firearms, are a major security issue. So even though in reality less people are killed in a year than in some cities in Central America in a day, the perception of insecurity is very high, and that is important because that impacts a lot on people's lives in many different aspects. I think the quote from the Human Security Development Report was from 20 years back, and there has obviously been a shift in policies, but it's a slow shift. It's increasingly acknowledged that security goes beyond the military, and that security is context-specific. It is acknowledged that security undermines development, so we have all those discussions around post-2015 and whether aspects of safety and security should be a part of those discussions, because fear, insecurity, violence undermines efforts to sustainable development, whether it's health, education, infrastructure, employment. It is also important to look at local level security, at those broader aspects of security. Is important to diffuse tensions early on, so to prevent conflict upstream. People need to be at the center of security, which doesn't mean that security institutions, security providers are not relevant. Of course they are. So this shift is happening, but it's happening slowly. I think it's challenging for many actors to translate this into practice, whether it's donors, implementing agencies, or the security providers. I think for donors it's very often difficult because they have their specific funding pots that are linked to either education or to security or to something else. So to have something that is cross-cutting is often, the box is kind of missing. Difficult for INGOs as well, because what works, not many INGOs are working on those different aspects. And it is challenging because how can you be an expert at the same time in security, in health, in education? Is that possible at all? Is that necessary? But also for governments and security providers, particularly in places where the focus is often more on having more equipment or having on budgetary support, or where security and working on security, particularly from civil society, might be seen as an interference in internal issues. I think those more conventional approaches to security sector reform you're probably more familiar with them than I am, so I will not go through them, but I guess important to mention one thing, that the change from a more, I think, conventional approach to security sector reform, focusing on national security institutions, to a more people-focused approach, has a lot to do with, obviously, power relations and giving away power, giving away responsibilities, but also accepting responsibilities. So it's not only a one-way thing. It's not only about the government giving away power. It's also about the communities accepting that they have responsibilities as well. So it's about broader social changes. I'm not talking about this, but I can later if there's time. Just to provide a couple of thoughts on what national security institutions, what often characterizes them. This is not very context specific. I've tried to look at a couple of different contexts and some similarities that often come up, but they obviously don't apply to all contexts and to all security institutions. So very often there's a prioritization of national security priorities, and the understanding of the local priorities is often not there. There's not much analysis in terms of what is really happening in the different parts of the country, what are really priorities in different parts of the country. And that is often also linked to a top-down approach. So if there's a strong top-down approach, maybe even like a very centralized approach where you have these dynamics between the center and the periphery, and the periphery is more marginalized, then the focus is almost naturally on central level needs. Very often there's still, I think, a concept about protection for the state, protection for the government. That's the task of security providers, and sometimes even protection of the government and the state from the citizens. So there is often really a divide between security providers and citizens, certainly not in all places. Very often also because of the top-down approach, while the central level institutions are often very well equipped, and there's a high level of expertise with expert units and so on, at the local level the situation often looks very different. There's hardly any equipment, there's hardly any budget. Police officers don't even have bikes to travel to the villages, and that's sometimes the case in Nepal. And yeah, often a perception that security is something that should be dealt with by the government, by the police. And that is often linked to a perception that civil society has no role to play and the people don't really have a role to play. And as I said before, that's not only a perception by the government, it's in many cases also a perception by people who are used to the government taking care of things, and who also then make the government responsible for maybe failures in security provision. In many cases, there is also a perception that security should be the role of the Ministry of Interior and not of other, or Ministry of Home and not of other ministries, or Ministry of Home and Ministry of Defense, but not other ministries. So the role that Ministry of Development or Ministry of Education or Ministry of, like in some countries, Ministry of Women or Youth, that they might also play a role in the overall discussions around security. That is not there, so the coordination and cooperation across sectors. Political roles, political interests are very important. Institutional pride and traditions, I think that's also something that we shouldn't underestimate, whether it's because that also shapes, obviously, relationships between agencies and communities. Yeah, and in terms of legislation, so in some contexts we have very good legislation and policies, but they might lack implementation. For example, Nepal is one case where actually there are a lot of very progressive policies and legislation in place, but implementation could be better. In other countries, legislation is lacking, is not good enough, so those challenges exist obviously as well. What consequences does that have for the local level? Local safety and security concerns are often different from national level safety and security concerns, and they're often neglected. There's limited access to security and justice providers, whether that's because of them just not being present in more remote locations, because they might be based only in the headquarters, it might be difficult to reach them, so just these physical aspects of accessibility. But it's often also difficult for specific social groups to have access to them. For example, for women who might not be allowed to travel on their own, which in cases of domestic violence is a challenge, then to get to security providers, or because if there are certain groups like that for ethnic or religious or caste reasons might not feel comfortable to approach the security providers because they might be dominated by other groups. Limited trust in security providers often plays a role, and the trust is often mutual between security providers and communities. They might not always be seen as legitimate and not inclusive, and very often that results in a situation where people feel disempowered, or they just say, okay, we don't have a responsibility for security at all, it's the role of the government. So we often see a growing disconnect between community members and government agencies and security providers. There's a risk that tensions might then increase at the local level if there is no one who could intervene. So if there are tensions exist already, but there's no one who could intervene, that can be challenging, and obviously people might just not feel safe and secure. So the support for security and justice providers and for institutions at the central level is obviously important, or for the institutions in general is obviously important. And we see that also on a day-to-day basis, for example, in Nepal, where the lack of equipment, the lack of police stations in some places is a big challenge, the lack of qualified personnel. So that support is very important, but it is not sufficient. It might actually, if there's only support to those institutions, it might reinforce structural inequalities and hierarchies in power structures, and it might further alienate the public from the state institutions and will not address the security concerns of the people. So that's why it is important to understand and address the concerns of communities, to improve relationships and share responsibilities, and to do that, to engage at the local level with local communities, with the different groups within local communities, and with government authorities and security providers. So that's where we come from, the community safety approach. What is community safety or community security approach? Why I often say community safety, maybe just to explain, in many languages there's only one word for safety and security, and it's very often understood as military security. And in most contexts where we work on community safety, or probably in all, when we work on community security, we don't work on military security. So that's why I often say community safety, because in Nepal that is an issue. Community security is a people-centered approach to addressing insecurity. It integrates the different dimensions of security. It integrates development, it integrates state building, and it integrates peace building. It works by bringing together different stakeholders, both from the demand and the supply side. So whether it's the community members and different parts of the community who have demands, or a supply side, which is basically security providers and government stakeholders. They jointly develop, prioritize and discuss issues, and develop solutions to addressing those issues. And that builds the capacity and willingness to address those issues, and to communicate, to engage in a constructive way. Community security creates an enabling environment, not only for addressing security issues, but also for other reforms, for other processes, because it does improve relationships and builds trust. Safer World has worked on community security approaches for 10 years in different contexts, I think starting in Europe, but also now we do that a lot in Africa and Central Asia and in South Asia. And we brought together some good practices, some lessons learned in a handbook, which I think you all have. So that might be helpful to look at. I guess what the handbook calls for, and I think what we advocate for, is to bridge the gap between different areas of work that I have outlined, and to incorporate security as part of development and peace building and state building. We would like to move beyond technical approaches and work more politically. So, as I said, like looking at changing power structures is always a political process as well. Improvement of state and society relations are important, and balancing the immediate impact with the longer term view. And we have the author of the handbook here, so he can provide a lot of answers to questions that might exist. I think I talked about that already. So community security contributes to improved relationships within the community and between community and security providers. It increases the level of agency of community members, but also awareness of responsibilities. It improves implementation of legislation and policies, or it can contribute to that. And it can help security providers to reach out to communities more effectively, in the end be more effective in their work, and to improve security perceptions. What does that look like on the ground? We put together a program cycle, which is not very different, I guess, from a lot of other project cycles. But I guess it might be useful to go through some of those different stages. Community security is a very reflective and consultative approach. So it's really about bringing people together in a process. And the process is really, really important. So it goes from a phase of preparation and analysis, which is very, very important because it also includes a lot of trust building, to a phase where the different groups come together and in the end implement or prioritize their security concerns, identify their security concerns, and discuss them. And this discussion part is also very important because it can already help to bridge a lot of gaps. Then moving on to an action planning and an action implementation phase. And then obviously the evaluation, the learning, and then also sharing lessons learned is important as a fifth stage. The first stage, the preparation and conflict analysis stage, I think it's probably one of the most important stages. What we have learned from a lot of work that we've been doing is the relevance of trust building in that phase. Having a good conflict analysis in place first to understand the general context and keeping in mind that depending on where you work, even in a small country, or if you work in a district, depending on where you are, the context might be very different. Then identifying partner organizations to work with, building their capacity, and then going out to the communities and to the sites and to do trust building. The trust building, we have started with trust building of like a month or 2 months, and we've seen that that's not sufficient. So we just spent a lot of time to bring the different parts of communities together, to also establish trust between civil society and authorities and communities. It's crucial, and we often continue with trust building almost throughout the project. One important point in that phase is also to identify the right people to work with and the right mechanisms to work with. Now, those local mechanisms can look very different. Where possible, we try to work with existing mechanisms. Where they don't exist, it might be necessary to establish mechanisms. It is important to be as inclusive and as participatory as possible. So, and that is often a challenge with existing mechanisms because they might be none of that. Very often existing mechanisms are, like, particularly if they have some decision-making power, it's often older people, it's often men. Trying to be inclusive, trying to involve people from different genders, different age groups, different ethnic and caste and religious groups. Not necessarily looking at the demographics in the country, but looking at like who is living in the community, who should be involved. The local authorities and security providers should be involved. They might not be part of the specific mechanisms. In some countries, for example in Nepal, we involve them in an advisory group where we have security providers, local authorities and some traditional authorities present. That's working very well. Just to give you an example again from Nepal, so the gender balance and the age balance, which we've, I think, managed to achieve fairly well. And then the split up between the different caste and ethnic groups. The next step is the identification and prioritization of communities' security problems and needs.
Sorry.
So we often do a smaller joint analysis with the community members using simple tools, and then discuss the problems together. And this discussion, this initial identification process is important for people to appreciate each other's security concerns. For example, we in, I think, Tajikistan, we had a group where we had to, in order to make it inclusive, we had to have separate discussions with the men and with the women because it was not really appropriate for the men and women to sit together, and women wouldn't talk freely about their issues. So we had separate meetings, and the women said, the men, I think, wanted to have a car to reach to the next market to make business, because like economic insecurity was one of their security priorities. For the women, the security priority was when they went to fetch water, there were a lot of wild dogs, or wolves, I'm not sure anymore, and they were attacked and they were afraid. And when that was brought to the attention of men, they first said, yeah, well, fetching water, why should water be an issue? You can just get the water. What is the problem? But when they understood what the women go through when they go to fetch water, and that it is dangerous for them, and it's their wives, it's their daughters, it's their sisters who have to fetch the water, they understood that that is actually a matter of concern. So in the end, the community decided to look at the water issue rather than at the car issue. Okay. To have that process, to have people understand their security concerns is important to bridge some of those gaps. And there's a joint prioritization, so it's not the person with the loudest voice who decides what's happening, but it's a joint process to identify which are the issues that should be addressed and that can realistically be addressed, because not all issues can be addressed. The communities develop action plans. It's a very simple format to decide what they are going to do, who's going to do what do we need to get it done. One lesson that we have learned is that it's important not only to discuss the issues, but actually to be able to do something about it, because otherwise it can be not only frustrating for communities if they say, okay, now we know what the problems are, but we can't address them. But it can also undermine security providers and government agencies if there are demands, but there's no supply to address the problems. Those funds are often very, very small. It's a couple of $100s. But a lot can be done with that money, because it's a lot about the cooperation between the different community members and with government authorities. Community members can allocate land if they need land to address security problems. They can allocate time, labor, material. Very often the government authorities, they provide some budget or they include the activity in their annual plans to implement it. So the contribution from the communities is important, but it's often very important to give some kind of seed funding. And then the action plans are being implemented jointly. And then the whole process is also about like evaluating, monitoring, and learning. So what we often do is we try to apply a participatory approach to monitoring and evaluation. So we discuss with community members and stakeholders involved from the start what change they would like to see and what they think is realistically possible. And then to see, okay, are we getting there? And so it's them in the end deciding on whether things worked out well or didn't work out well. We obviously also try to get a better understanding of the changes in terms of relationships, of the changes in terms of security provision. And it's very important for us, on the one hand, to learn for future programming, but also to share those best practices and lessons learned with others, including at the policy level, at the decision-making level, whether in country or at a more international level. And that brings me to the last point, linking the local with the national, because obviously sharing those best practices and those lessons through advocacy with policymakers is an important way to bring those experiences to the national level beyond just local level efforts. What is also important is to have district or central level authorities, whether it's security providers or from other government agencies, to be in touch with them, to allow them to visit some of the community meetings, to bring them to the ground, and to bring community members to the central level if possible, so that they are also part of the process, even though they might not be there on a day-to-day basis, but that they understand and appreciate the process. And we have very often seen that that is very powerful, because if they are transferred to other locations, or if they are in an important political position, if they see the benefits, that can be very powerful, and we've seen that in a lot of places. We have in some contexts been able to provide direct expertise and feedback into policy discussions, into drafting of legislation, into drafting of policies. So that is obviously powerful as well. But also working with civil society. We always work through civil society partners, and I think to encourage civil society to engage constructively on safety and security issues is very important, because that also then ensures that security provision is a more democratic approach, and it's a more inclusive approach beyond the engagement of an organization like Safer World, but that it's run locally and it's continued locally. And then I guess by complementing existing initiatives, and there are many existing initiatives, whether it's initiatives run by security providers, community-based policing or outreach activities, initiatives run by other ministries, initiatives also run by other development partners who might not really think about taking their own projects and also using addressing some of the security challenges through their development activities, for example. And as I said, like those local security challenges, they are often very like soft challenges. It's often about like alcohol. It's about alcohol abuse that can lead to aggression. So it's about local youth getting involved in drug issues, in small scale stealing. So it's not about those militarized security issues. Yeah, and maybe because my time is up.
Do you want to maybe just say
the
briefly the challenges that
points?
we can then pick them up in discussion.
And I guess those are some of those challenges I've mentioned already, and I think it's more really about discussing those challenges with you, getting your thoughts as well. I guess one of the big challenges is that when we talk about changing security provision, making it more people-centered, changing attitudes and behavior, that is something that takes a lot of time. I think both for institutions, which are obviously it takes more time to change an institution, but I think also at an individual level, changing behavior towards people from the other gender, changing attitudes and behavior towards people from another group, taking more responsibilities on certain issues, or maybe giving more responsibilities to someone else, that all takes a lot of time. Very often project cycles are 1 year, 2 years, you're really lucky 3 years. It's often not sufficient. I think it's really important to think about the more longer term. Working to the right scale. What is the right scale? We've had a lot of discussions around that, and it depends very much on the context. Is the right scale just working at the right level with the right stakeholders, and it sometimes just takes a little bit to convince, to push into the right direction? Or is the right scale like a very broad geographical approach, working in many different locations, trying to reach as many people as possible? Can mean many different things. The question about linking community security with justice, linking community security with governance. Obviously, security and justice are very, very closely linked. With a very good security provision, if the justice system is not working, it's kind of getting us, well, at least not very far. A people-centered approach to security has a lot to do with governance. It has a lot to do with devolving power. It has a lot to do with accountability, with transparency. So this link between security, local or community security and governance is something that is quite interesting. Measuring success, I've shared a couple of experiences and good practices that we are using. At the same time, we also face challenges. So how do we go beyond mainly looking at perceptions of people? And I think that's a challenge in security programming in general. And then, this huge variety of security issues. So a lot of the local security issues, like some of those requests are really linked to development and infrastructure. So is that something that security providers or NGOs, civil society can address? So this huge range of security issues, how can that be addressed in a manageable, in a coordinated way? And then being realistic. So the approach can't fix everything, it can't fix all. It's working in some contexts, it's working on some issues, but there are obviously limitations. Again, those limitations are different in each context. And I think there are always challenges that are coming up. I think in every context where we work, there are new challenges coming up. And it's sometimes, we're about trying to find out what can it realistically achieve in this context under those circumstances, and what can it not achieve, what is it not suitable for. Yeah, I guess those are some of the challenges, some of the questions that we would very much like to discuss with you.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Thank you.